Hello. For this lecture supplement, I'd like to get us thinking about a story from within Spanish Catholicism, which is the story of the Holy Child of La Guardia. Now, this is a picture which, I don't know how well you can see that. That's a statue of the Holy Child of La Guardia, which is still standing today in that town in Spain. The story relates, as it's told within Catholicism, that back in 1491, give or take, a man called Benito Garcia was arrested. Now, Garcia was a Jewish person who had converted to Christianity, what was termed at the time a conversio. And when he was stopped by the local guards and searched, they supposedly found in a bag he was carrying a wafer, a communion wafer, which, whilst there are certain circumstances under which you might take a communion wafer out of a church, it was still considered a fairly dubious thing to do, spiritually dubious thing. Why would you not just eat it as part of the communion service? Why would you take it away? So there were all sorts of questions asked. And he was taken away and interrogated. Bear in mind, back in the 1400s, the standard form of interrogation involved lots of red-hot pokers and violence and general brutality. So it wasn't just asking a few questions. He would have been roughed up and very ill-treated and kept in unbelievably squalid, filthy conditions in a dungeon, probably half-starved and spending his nights frozen nearly to death in a cell full of rats. So it would have been very unpleasant. He then told his interrogators that the wafer was going to be used in various black magic rituals, and that whilst he was a conversio, he had been led back into Judaism by various other people, and he named names. So the authorities then went and arrested the people he had named, and they were interrogated, and it got sort of, one thing led to another, it got nastier and nastier. And one of the particular people who was seen as the ringleader in this sort of luring ex-Jews back into Judaism was a chap called Josef Franco, who was a young man. Garcia was in about 60 odd at the time of his arrest. Josef was around about 20 at the time. And he was seen as a ringleader in the Jewish community. Now, it has to be borne in mind that at this point in Spanish history, Catholicism had become very, very militant, and its approach to other religions was not tolerant. So the Jews were frequently not tolerated. They were frequently subjected to all manner of harassment and violence and so on. And there was a direct encouragement to convert Jews and to convert Muslims and so forth to Christianity. But even when they had converted, there was a lot of paranoia that they were only sort of playing along with it. It was lip service. They weren't really Christians, that they were sliding back into their previous family religions and so on. So there was always a lot of suspicion in the Catholic communities about just how Christian Jewish and Muslim converts really were. And there's a lot of paranoia playing into this. During the interrogation of Garcia and Franco and these various other people, someone claimed that they had been involved in the murder of a Christian child. And this is an idea known as the blood libel. And it crops up again and again and again in all sorts of different countries as an accusation made against the Jewish community. If you're not familiar with the idea, the blood libel is the notion that was very widely held to in Christianity for quite a long period of time, that the Jews engaged in black magic, they engaged in all sorts of demonic, sinister, very kind of hammer horror type activities, part of which would involve them abducting a Christian child and murdering the child in an act of ritual sacrifice. So again, we're back to that sort of horror movie atmosphere going on. And the blood of the child would be used in magical rituals and frequently mixed in with matzo flour to make matzo balls. If you don't know what that is, a matzo ball basically is like a dumpling that you would put in chicken soup. It's flour and water mixed up, basically. Obviously, somewhat unsanitary to make it out of blood, but sanitation aside, it was seen as just as Christians would drink the blood of Christ and eat the flesh of Christ in the transubstantiation, that this was a sort of a mocking, a parallel to that, and the blood of the dead Christian child was a way of not only engaging in magical acts, but of mocking the transubstantiation and all sorts of really, by modern standards, very, very paranoid, very delusional accusations and ideas. But the blood libel was made time and time again. So often if a Christian child went missing or was found dead in a ditch somewhere, and there happened to be Jewish people living somewhere vaguely nearby, in that town, that village, that city, somebody somewhere would point the finger at the Jewish community and say, oh, it must have been one of them. And you could get irate mobs storming down to chuck bricks to the windows of Jewish homes, to set light to Jewish shops, to, if there was a synagogue in the area, to attack the synagogue, drag a load of random Jewish people out of their houses, accuse one of them of being the murderer of the child or the abductor of the missing child, and usually again with torture and lots of duress. People would confess out of fear of their lives, and even if they later retracted their confession in court, that was enough pretty much to have them condemned and executed, and very rarely was it just one person who was accused and charged. Often it would be whole groups of Jewish people who were accused of participating in the rituals, therefore they were all guilty, and they'd all be tortured and executed and so on. It may seem difficult in the 21st century to imagine the mentality that led to that sort of thing, but it was very, very common. And if you think of the kind of stories that were being told by the Nazis during the Weimar Republic, when they were gradually gaining power, and they were, even before Hitler got elected, that whole sort of atmosphere of intense fear that the Jews were taking over, they were controlling the banks, they were doing this, they were doing that. And I say the Nazis, you can go on any social media and find people to this very day, whole groups of people who otherwise look reasonably sane in other respects, who will bang on and on and on about how Jews are controlling the world and Jews are doing this and Jews are doing that. So you get, even though it's not common to hear the blood sacrifice story these days, you still get this crazy, unhinged anti-Semitic rantings from people who you would think would be better educated and ought to know better, but it happens. So it's not just some weird medieval thing, this is an ongoing problem, this obsessive hatred of the Jews. Anyway, back to Guardia. So somebody in one of the suspects who was being accused says, oh, we abducted a child, we took part in a ritual, etc. The chances of there being the remotest truth to that confession are next to zero. No child had been reported missing. No child had been found dead. But the authorities took it that this confession was sufficient. They didn't need to find the body. They didn't need to find some distressed mother or father worrying about where their sprog had got to or anything like that. So at no point during the trial did anyone say, my child has gone missing. At no point did anyone say, here is the body of my murdered child. So there were no parents. The name of the child remains a mystery from that day to this. There have been works of fiction, written novels and that sort of thing, which give a name to the child, but that's at a much later date, and that's just an author dreaming up a name to give to the child. At the time of the trial, with the records kept by the Inquisition and so on, the child is never named, the family is never named. It's just accepted that some anonymous child has been murdered. There's not even a blood stain brought into evidence, so we're not talking CSI, Le Guardia or anything like that. It's incredibly circumstantial. But these accusations are made. Thomas de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, one of the most notorious leaders of the Inquisition, gets involved and sanctions the trials and says they're going in the right direction and all of that sort of thing. And very rapidly, again with aid of torture, etc., convictions are gained. Various legal experts are called in and they all approve of the process and say, oh yes, the evidence, such as it is, is more than sufficient to have these people convicted. And finally, the convictions are pronounced, and as was standard practice, the Inquisition then gives the guilty parties over to the local authorities, the secular authorities, so the local, the mayor or the king or whoever it happens to be in a given region, and it is the secular authorities that deal with the actual execution. So whilst you've got the bishops and the monks and priests and so on present at the execution, watching it, observing it, delivering prayers and sermons and so on, technically it is the civil authorities actually lighting the pyre. And this is one of these rather dubious areas that some very sympathetic historians, sympathetic to the Catholic Church, emphasise heavily, and it's seen as somehow washing the blood from the hands of the inquisitors, which frankly is dubious. But anyway, that's a side point. So upshot is 9 people who are either still practicing as Jews or claim to have converted to Christianity but are suspected of not being very passionate converts are accused and executed, burnt at the stake, and die, without anyone ever knowing who the child is. So that statue in the picture there, that's just, if you like to think of it in this way, it's an artist's impression of what the child might have looked like, because no one ever saw the child dead or alive. So this is a sort of a sculptor's rendering, which stands still to this very day in La Guardia. Back in the late 80s, there was a TV documentary, which I remember seeing, which was all about different aspects of the Inquisition and so on. And they went to the town of La Guardia and sort of did a bit of a touristy thing and looked at the churches and so on. And they interviewed the abbot of a local monastery, who at the time I guess would be around about 70 years old, something like that. So an elderly man. And he swore blind that the story of the Holy Child, the murder, the associated miracles that were meant to have been performed after the child's death and so on, were absolutely, utterly true. This is in the 1980s. That the Jews really had murdered this little boy, and afterwards, as a holy saint, as a martyr, he had performed X, Y, and Z miracles. But whilst he never said modern day Jews get up to murders and so on, the implication behind what he was saying in the interview was that this was not something of the past. This is what Jews get up to. So this is a leading, or was, he's obviously dead now, a leading luminary in the Catholic Church, arguing with utter conviction, utter belief, that this story of the blood libel, this particular instance, if not every single example, but certainly this particular instance, was true. This really did happen. The Vatican itself has suggested that the story of La Guardia is a terrible mistake. It was a false accusation. The people who were burnt at the stake were probably innocent. There was never a child murdered, etc., etc. But the churches dedicated to the saint, the child saint, there are a number of other child saints around the world, but this particular one, they still stand. The devotion of everyday people going along to the churches is still there. The story of why this child became a saint are still told. And on the website of the Archdiocese of Madrid, the story is still listed as one of the local saints' accounts from the local hagiographies, and is listed as a true story. So the blood libel is still being maintained. So on one hand you've got the Vatican in Rome saying no, 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 and on the other hand you've got the Archdiocese in Madrid, the local Archdiocese, saying yes, yes, yes. So that is an interesting point that I'd like to discuss in class. The emphasising the fact that this is not all museum piece, ancient history, long since dead and gone. These issues are still ongoing and are still present in the modern world, and are still regarded. And indeed, there are in the monastery of St Thomas in Avia, they have the host that was supposedly confiscated from Benito Garcia, the one that was going to be used in various black magic sorcery rituals, is a holy relic. Now, whether it is that, profoundly unlikely it's the same one, but the belief is that this host, this wafer, is that wafer, that original one. So that's still a thing that pilgrims visit and want to see and want to touch and take very, very literally. And if people, obviously people's interest in the saint is more perhaps that he will heal their illnesses, he will help with this, he will help with that. But to regard him as a saint, they have to accept the story that he was murdered by Jews. That's part and parcel of the devotion to the saint, is not just the praying for some little boy in heaven who will look down on them and cure their illnesses or do nice things. It's accepting that quite grim story, that very anti-Semitic story, as part and parcel of the reality of that saint. So that's something I'd like to emphasise and like to take on board. I'm not saying for 1 minute all Catholics take this approach. Vast numbers of Catholics would be horrified by the level of anti-Semitism that they would see in stories like that. And it's not something confined to Catholics. You get exactly the same stories being told in a Protestant context, the same beliefs existing within a Protestant context as well. And in other religions, the blood libel is something that you can also, or similar stories to the blood libel rather, are something you can hear bandied around by Muslims who are very anti-Semitic. So it's not confined to one particular religious movement, one particular church. It spreads to different religions, different sets of beliefs, different cultures, different periods of history. But this repeated obsession with what heated imaginations imagine Jewish people get up to, and where those stories then lead them in terms of how they react, how they respond to Jewish people, and how governments react and respond in terms of enacting laws. Not so much these days, but certainly in the past. It's not just a few crazy people running through the streets with pitchforks and burning torches like they do in the old horror movies. This is, or was, government involvement, church hierarchy involvement, sanctioning, approving, policing Jewish people in a very, very violent, brutal way, on the basis of no evidence whatsoever. It's the if you like, the very, very dark side of heresy is not so much what people actually got up to in the communities that had the finger being pointed at them, but what the people who were doing the finger pointing were getting up to, and how they were using allegations of heresy, allegations of sinister beliefs and sinister practices to enact really quite brutal, horrifying, oppressive crimes against humanity, which is what fundamentally 9 times out of 10 boils down to. So a bit of a grim story there to recount to you, but hopefully you found it interesting, and it's something that I'm hoping will lead to some discussion in class as to the whys and wherefores of that story, and you might come across related stories of anti-Semitic persecutions tied up with mainstream religious beliefs, whether Christian or Islamic or anything else for that matter, where accusations of heresy become a weapon for enacting religious violence against the people accused of heresy.